Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're continuing our study, coming really to the end of our study. We have two more sessions of a study I've entitled Three Psalms: Psalm 23, Psalm 90, and Psalm 103, which are connected to each other, which interlock. We looked yesterday, last time we were together, at the text of Psalm 103, like we did for Psalm 23 and Psalm 90. We want to talk about the portrait of God that it paints. Um, it is almost like David in Psalm 103 takes his portrait of God in Psalm 23 and Moses' portrait of God in Psalm 90, and he superimposes them on each other so that we have a three-dimensional picture of God. Years ago, in St. Clairsville, Ohio, my uh, youth intern, Kevin Wolfgang, who went on to be a wonderful gospel preacher and who passed awfully young at the age of 37 from soft tissue cancer. Anyway, one of the things he used to do with the youth group, and I'll never forget this. He used to take a ball of yarn, and then he'd say something. He'd say something loving to someone, and then he'd throw it to them. We'd sit in a circle, and then you'd do that till you'd pass it around a long time, and you had to hold the yarn, that you had, and sometimes you were holding three strands of it, but you kept doing it until you ran out of yarn. And you'd make these lovely patterns, and you'd lay them down, and then you'd back up, and he'd say, "We've just drawn a picture of God." Nobody knows what God looks like, but there's that passage you would read it from 1 John 4. We love each other. God's in us, and we know what God is, and we know who God is, and we know what God looks like. And this is and it's like David is doing that, you know, giving us a tangible, three-dimensional picture of who God is by taking his portrait in Psalm 23 and Moses' portrait in Psalm 90 and superimposing them on each other so that we get a three-dimensional portrait. We get in Psalm 103 a God who is everlasting, a God who is omniscient and omnipotent, a God who is perfect and pure and good, and also a God who loves us. And we understand that before him we are sinners and we are deeply flawed and we are mortal and temporary on this planet. But God changes all that. God redeems us from the pit. He heals our diseases. He forgives our iniquities. Why? Because God loves us. And because not only is God from everlasting to everlasting, but God's love is from everlasting to everlasting. It is God's love that makes the difference. It's God's love that pulls us out of the pit that Psalm 90 leaves us in by the end of that psalm and takes us to the heaven that David expects in Psalm 23 and in the end of Psalm 103. In fact, David has clearly understood what John will say to us in 1 John chapter 4 verse 8 when he explains all of the universe in just 3 words. God is love. He who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God because God is love. And 1,000 years, because David's writing around 1000 BC, 1,000 years before John ever wrote this, 1,100 years before John ever wrote this, David understood it. And David wants to go back in time and tell it to Moses. I think we do see a great deal of empathy. I mean, these two men were cast in similar places. They had to establish the Lord's people as a nation in their own particular way, and they did their own wilderness. They both did their own wilderness wanderings. David not as long as Moses did, but for a good decade was wandering around, the hill country of southwest Palestine, trying to evade Saul, excuse me, and trying to protect the border of God's people from the Philistines, and doing both successfully, but on the run for 10 years. I mean, there's so much that binds these two men together and that gives David a special understanding of what it was to be Moses and to understand the life that he led, leading God's people. But Moses' portrait of God was two-dimensional. It was clear, the outlines were true. I mean, everything that he said was absolutely true, but it wasn't everything that was true. And David gives us that 3D portrait in Psalm 103 that he doesn't really even give us in Psalm 23, because in Psalm 23 he talks about our mortality and our dependence, but he doesn't really talk about our sin. But he addresses our sin head on in Psalm 103 and the grace that we receive from God to deal with our sin. We're going to have one final lesson on these three Psalms together as we kind of sum them up next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.